so we have an international audience as well as our audience in the room today. We also have an overabundance of people here, so I believe we have an overflow room as well. So I want to welcome the people in the overflow room and our international audience, and please invite former Prime Minister Odinga to the podium.
Thank you very much for introduction. Let me begin first by acknowledging my old friend Johnny Carson, who is in the audience here, the former ambassador of the United States to Kenya and Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. But I can also see quite a number of familiar faces in the audience here. Well, let me say that I'm very pleased to be here this morning. I've been invited to come and talk to you about Africa, past, present, and the future. And I begin by saying that I'm talking to you as an Afro-optimist, as opposed to Afro-pessimist. I'm a Pan-Africanist who believe in the ability of African people to develop Africa. And that is the school that we call Afro-optimists. There are those who have given up on Africa, who say Africa is a basket case. Those are the Afro-pessimists. Now, 3 weeks ago, the heads of state of Africa gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. Some of you who may have followed the events in Addis Ababa, you no doubt agree with me that there was a feeling of deja vu, that Africa has arrived, that this is Africa's time, this is Africa's moment, and that the 21st century will be Africa's century. Much as I share part of the optimism, I still believe that a lot more needs to be done. And I thought that the confidence might be misplaced. Some of the statements which were made at Addis Ababa were so much akin to some which were made 50 years ago. So I'm saying that it is not enough to just be making statements without clear commitment to implementation. And then a lot of time was spent on what I consider to be mundane issues which really do not add value to African development. But 50 years ago, the heads of state gathered in Addis Ababa, the founding fathers of the African independence, led by Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Haile Selassie, Ahmed Sékou Touré, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, Modibo Keïta, just to mention but a few, and founded the OAU, the Organization for African Unity. So Africa has come a long way in this past half century. Those 50 years ago, as I've said, OAU was founded. Now the OAU, when it was founded, set itself 3 objectives. 1, the decolonization of Africa, the ending of apartheid in South Africa, and the promotion of peace and security throughout the continent. We have successfully realized the first 2 of these objectives. Our founding fathers, with the OAU as one of their instruments, succeeded in placing the African liberation agenda at the center of the post-World War II global politics. The OAU inspired many in Africa to fight for independence and accelerated Africa's wind of change. South Africa finally became free. However, the realization of the 3rd objective, that is the universal peace and security on the continent, has remained a challenge. When you talk about peace and security, you're not just talking about physical peace, because peace is not merely the absence of war. We're talking about peace from hunger, peace from ignorance, and peace from general deprivation. This is what we talk about. So, ladies and gentlemen, OAU has come a long way from its beginnings on a liberation platform through its middle years as a regional integration agency to its present function and mandate under this newer name, which is the African Union. Its history and geopolitical context have defined the dynamism of both its mandate and mission, which it received in the context of a bipolar global environment. The Cold War played a large part in defining the role of the OAU, the role that it would play in decolonization and in protecting the sovereignty of the newly independent African states. There were a number of challenges, chief among them that the OAU lacked the diplomatic and military capacity to deal with the Cold War generated and intra-African conflicts. It was faced with carving out for itself a respectable and strategically effective niche within the increasingly assertive non-aligned movement. It also had to grapple with the well-orchestrated undermining of Africa's progressive leadership by the Cold Warriors and the conservative Western establishments of the time. This determined the fates of Nkrumah, Ben Bella, Patrice Lumumba, and Thomas Sankara, among others. In the area of development policies, the Lagos Plan of Action for Economic Development of Africa, that is 1980 to 2000, stands out as a great achievement given its admirable attempt to provide African economies with a new and progressive development paradigm and an escape from the neocolonial development policy framework. This was made possible by the progressive agenda of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, which is based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Significant changes have since taken place in the global political arena. We have moved from the Cold War through a US-dominated world order to the ongoing shift towards multilateralism. This made necessary a strategic rethinking of the OAU's posture and architecture. Now, the former presidents who we credit with this new development are Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, Olusegun Obasanjo of Nigeria, Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, and an international civil servant, Kingsley Amoaku of Ghana, who midwifed the AU from the OAU. They envisaged a continent defined by peace, security, economic prosperity, and mutually beneficial engagement with the international community. So, ladies and gentlemen, against this background, allow me to share my vision of what Africa could and should look like in 50 years' time. I dream of a continent that will long have consigned poverty to history. It will have a youthful, skilled, and healthy population, and will serve as a granary, factory floor, and supplier to the world. It will be a continent that has made the 21st century its own, and whose key development indicators match the global standards. I believe that this vision is within our reach and that it is actually realizable. But it will be realized only if there is vigorous and sustained implementation of policy and institutional reforms, not mere rhetorics, grandstanding, chest thumping, like what we saw recently in Addis Ababa. To help achieve this goal, the AU needs to be vigorous in guiding Africa to a new awakening across all indicators of human endeavor towards a continental democratic revolution. There must be a deliberate strategy to develop the continent's productive forces, ensuring inclusive economic growth and fostering an environment where the creative energy and synergy of Africa's peoples finds free rein. Indeed, our development trajectory will be conditional primarily on how we Africans manage our political, economic, and technological relations internally and internationally. This means that we must embrace all aspects of human rights, political, economic, social, environmental, and informational. Better governance of mineral revenues, higher agricultural prices, the demographic dividend, and the rapid urbanization represents opportunities for making the growth more inclusive and more effective in reducing poverty. Key drivers in this regard include: 1, quality leadership and citizen involvement, leading to capability and effectiveness in development. 2, the expansion of the formal democracy to include skillful management of social contradictions and the forging of social compacts to promote social inclusivity. 3, assured free, fair, and democratic multi-party elections. We have yet to achieve this goal, as demonstrated in Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Cote d'Ivoire recently, to mention but 3 examples. 4, the continental will to pool sovereignty in political and economic policy, not so much to develop an African government, but rather, as East Asia did, in synergic osmosis. 5, the development of strategic acumen to manage the changing economic power balances across the continent, which might otherwise lead to unhealthy competition and even conflict. In addition, non-state actors, such as private entrepreneurs, academics, researchers, and activists in the media and the arts, should claim to be and be afforded space to support and nurture Pan-African revival. The recent move to exclude civil society actors from African Union events in Addis Ababa militate against such social inclusivity. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look forward to the next 50 years, it goes without saying that improved healthcare, physical security, quality education, food self-sufficiency, and food security are priorities for Africa. Our success in these areas will depend on developing new and creative ideas in line with the technological advances. It will depend on creating wealth from our abundant natural resources and on harnessing the human capital necessary to achieve our objectives. The development outcomes for the coming decades will be determined by various drivers of change, that is, the global, ideological, ecological, and human. The African Development Bank has said that continued rapid population growth will result in an absolute increase in Africa's working age population to about 1.87 billion by the year 2060. That's a huge population. Our success will depend largely on the quality of the policies that Africa evolves to take advantage of this vibrant young population. As has been said, young population can be a blessing, but can also be a curse. This human resource will need applicable knowledge and skills to propel the continent forward. We can therefore not gainsay the need to increase investment in education, training, and research. Looking at global forces, we see three major areas that will affect us deeply: the changing structure of the global trade, new trends in technology, and the international architecture governing trade, finance, and the development assistance. Over the past decade, the acronym BRICS, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has come to symbolize the growing power of the world's largest emerging economies and their potential impact on the global economic and increasingly the political order. The economic muscle of BRICS members makes it imperative for Africa to define its relationship with this bloc now and to place itself strategically to benefit from those countries, their thirst for resources and markets for their goods and services. How Africa leverages and harnesses its natural resources and how it sets the terms of its relationship with global partners will help determine the path of change in the continent's favor. Because as I've always said, Africa is the richest continent in as far as resources are concerned. Unfortunately, the paradox is that it's also the poorest. This is what we must change. As far as ecological drivers of change are concerned, Africa faces three in relation to its physical environment. First, climate change. Second, the continent's renewable and non-renewable natural resources. And third, the continent's endowment of land and water, which is coming under increasing pressure. Currently, 79% of Africa's arable land remains uncultivated. Sustainable management of these resources will make a huge difference in the next 5 decades. Two major human conditions that will drive change in Africa in the next 50 years are a delayed demographic transition and the burden of HIV/AIDS. The often cited demographic dividend of Africa could turn out to be a demographic disaster without the right kind of investment in its population. Already, African cities are the fastest growing in the world. By 2035, Africa's labor force will be larger than that of China. By 2050, more than a quarter of the world's labor force will be African. And by 2060, the continent is likely to be home to more than 15 megacities of more than 10 million inhabitants. Cities are centers of innovation, and such shifts could facilitate higher growth rates, or they could mean a larger and larger slums with unimaginable and unmanageable social tensions and conflicts, as seen recently in relation to the so-called Arab Spring. How individual economies in Africa will fare in meeting these challenges will depend on choices made individually and collectively. One thing that goes without saying is that Africa's development over the next 50 years must be determined by Africans, with the international community playing a supportive role in the form of improved performance on trade and investments. I've mentioned only relations with BRICS, but Africa must continue to trade with its traditional partners, and that is Western Europe and the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, As we mark our proud heritage, there are disturbing trends with the potential to harm these great granaries of opportunity for future generations. While there were flickers of hope in Somalia, brought about by the election of a president last year and the partial defeat of the Al-Shabaab, the lack of physical security in Africa is still a major risk. In the Great Lakes region, conflicts continue, pollinated by economic interests and misunderstandings, as well as subjective emotions. The situation in Mali and in the Sahel region is another cause for great concern, as are the political problems in Guinea-Bissau and the Central African Republic. How can the AU really celebrate 50 years when, for instance, some of our member states are sanctuaries for narcotics trade? How can it celebrate when women in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo live in perpetual fear of conflict and rape by armed thugs? To effect real change, the African Union must demonstrate commitment beyond the spoken word and genuinely work towards lifting the majority of Africans from the poverty trap. There is no need in an island surrounded by a sea of poverty and ignorance. There is no freedom. As long as this continues, political freedom faces an uncertain future. Above all, Africa must keep at the forefront of its mind and the need to pursue the interests and aspirations of Africans. It must rebuff external efforts to divide, dominate, and rule. And as I have said, how successful we shall be in the coming 50 years will depend primarily on the people of Africa themselves. I have said time and again that we have been responsible for our backwardness for the last 50 years, so that we should not continue to be talking about colonialism. That the founding fathers came up with a very noble idea of African unity. But then the structure that they inherited were quickly changed. Ideology which developed that time, or the traditional African society did not broker opposition. That in Africa, leaders met and resolved disputes through dialogue. Leopold Senghor called it palaver, dialogue, where people sat under a tree and resolved conflicts. Nkrumah argued very passionately about it. The same thing with Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. They said that the gigantic task of nation building required consolidation of efforts. And therefore, through a series of measures, coercion, blackmail, bribery, the opposition was led into extinction. And thereafter, there we now developed the African strongman syndrome, the Monsieur le Président, Mr. President. So Mtukufu Rais, as we call them in Kenya, became now the norm. So the institution of the presidency became so powerful that it emasculated all other institutions of governance. And with that, with the disappearance of opposition, the checks and balances disappeared. Nepotism, tribalism, ethnicity, corruption became the order of the day. And that's a lot of resources were diverted to private pockets and hands, some of them finding their way into the bank accounts outside Africa. This is what is responsible for Africa's backwardness. That happened at the time of the Cold War, when there was a fight between the West and the East. So if you came to the West and said, I'm an ally in a war against communism, nobody cared how you ran your economy. You could be doing whatever you're doing, but you're an ally. That's how he tolerated Mobutu Sese Seko's of this world. He could kill his opponents the way he liked. Nobody cared. He would come to this country with a band of Franco. That is how he also tolerated Idi Amin Dada, the conqueror of British Empire. He could lynch millions of Ugandans, yet he was also appointed as the chairman of the Organization of African Unity. Jean Badel Bokassa of Central African Republic crowned himself the emperor of the Central African Republic, spending millions of dollars for his coronation. That's how he tolerated Kamuzu Banda of Malawi, the Ngwazi, who would say in a BBC interview that Chiume and Chipembere, who are his opponents, said that if they dare set foot in Malawi, there will be delicious meal for the crocodiles on the river Zambezi. But these were all tolerated. In the name of what? In the OAU? Non-interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. That when Mwalimu Nyerere sent his troops to Uganda in retaliation to Amin's invasion of Tanzania and liberated Uganda, instead of him being celebrated and cheered, he was scorned at the OAU meeting in Monrovia. That is the OAU. Now we changed all that. Now we said AU should be an improvement on OAU. From non-interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state to non-indifference to the violation of human rights in any member country. But that is just said in words, not in action. We want to see this happening in action. So ladies and gentlemen, let me in conclusion quote Frantz Fanon. His challenge to humanity was that, and I quote, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it, unquote. Fulfilling that mission, ladies and gentlemen, must be an abiding moral precept for Africa. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much for a delightful address. I really resonate to some of the things you said. If you will allow me to tell a personal story, my first foreign service assignment as a diplomat was in Uganda at the time of the Idi Amin coup, and very few of us like to remember that the Idi Amin coup was welcomed by the West, because it overthrew a leftward-leaning Milton Obote, who we all were very uncomfortable with. And Idi Amin, of course, went state visit and had tea with the Queen and all this stuff. We forget all of that now in retrospect, because he turned out to be such a bad guy. But we had blinders in those days for reasons that I won't elaborate on. Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency. That was a wonderful address. And as you know, the custom here at the Woodrow Wilson Center is to open to conversation with our audience. To remind the audience that we're being webcast live, so when I recognize you, please wait for a microphone to arrive and identify yourself so the Prime Minister will know who he's speaking to. With that, I throw the floor open. The first hand I saw was right at the back there. Yes. And then we'll come down here, Derek, to here and here.
Hello, sir. My name's Jill Craig. I'm with Voice of America's South